Welcome back to another episode of the Collaborative IEP podcast. I'm Ashley Barley, your host, and I am so happy you are here. Okay, friends, it has been a second. I recorded a bunch of episodes before I left for my 2-week spring break extravaganza. And now we are coming back and we are still in the middle of a section of IDEA. I really, really, really had hoped to record this episode before I left so that my mind stayed in this section, which, by the way, is section 1414 of IDEA. And it just didn't happen. Life is happening here too. As you know, I have a full-time job practicing law, and the collaborative IEP is really a side hustle that has grown and grown and become a little bit more of my, kind of day-to-day job as well. But anyway, I didn't get it done. And so we are going to refamiliarize ourselves with section 1414. I apologize for my voice. I just have this little bit of springtime gunk going on. And so we've got that going on. I also am super casual today, to be perfectly honest. I kind of missed my timeline, and so I'm recording this really, really late, and I still have a workout to do. So I was like, I'm not gonna wake up and get totally dressed and record so that Rachel has this to get it published for you all, and then work out. So you get me halfway to a workout. But as I used to say during COVID, I'm just as smart in Lululemon as I was in a suit. And I always think that's funny because I literally had to wear a suit jacket not too long ago, or a jacket, and I was like, I don't have a suit like that I am comfortable in right now, and I used to wear a suit every day. So times they are a changin'. Okay, I hope that you have had a wonderful spring. Spring is springing here in Greater Cincinnati. I'm looking out the window. I spent all weekend in the yard, which was very, very nice, except I look like I was in a cat fight because my hydrangea in the front yard, I don't like to mess with the new growth, old growth stuff. So I usually give it until June 1st to June 15th to see what's gonna grow on old growth, what's gonna, come up as new growth. I have endless summer in the front yard. Anyway, I still don't like to cut off the old growth. And so I reach in there. Unfortunately, there's a magnolia tree on top of my hydrangea above it. And those leaves are really hard to rake, to blow, to get out of anything because they're not wispy leaves. They're very dense and they're great for other things. Anyway, I have to reach in all those sticks and get the leaves out, and I seriously look like I've been in a cat fight. I don't know if it'll show up on the screen, but anyway, it happens every year, and that's what happens. I love being in the yard, and some people would probably wear long sleeves, but not me. Okay, let's refamiliarize ourselves with section 1414. As you will remember, the title of this section is Evaluations, Eligibility Determinations, Individualized Education Programs, and Educational Placements. So, where we're going today is we're going to talk more about the IEP. We left ourselves in the IEP document, and that's kind of where we're going to finish out this section. We don't have a whole lot to do at the end of this section, but you'll remember that the IDEA sections start with lowercase letters, and in this case, we have A through F. So A is evaluations, parental consent, and reevaluations. We have done that. B is evaluation procedures. We have done that. C is additional requirements for evaluations and reevaluations. We have done that. D is individualized education programs, and that's where we are. We have done number 1, definitions, and then number 2 is a requirement that the program be in effect. Number 3 is development of the IEP. 4 is review and revision of the IEP. 5 is multi-year IEP demonstration. And 6 is failure to meet transition objectives. 7 is children with disabilities in adult prisons. And then coming back out to our lowercase letters, where we were, where we started, then we'll talk a second about educational placements, which is in here. It doesn't give us a ton about placement, so don't get terribly excited. That comes later. And alternative means of meeting participation. Okay. And that's where we can attend electronically, foreshadowing to the end. So we don't have a ton to talk about here, but that's where we are. So where we are is in IDEA section 1414, and we are in subsection D, lowercase d, and then under D, we are still in, I want to get this right for you. Yes, we are in 1C, that one's a capital, and we're going to talk about, I'm sorry, we're not in C. Ha ha ha. See, it even happens to me. We are in 1B, and we're going to start with individualized education program team. Okay, so we're talking about the IEP team, and that's where we are going to start. Now, after D, we have a quick E and F that are very, very small, but we're going to pretty much live here in the IEP document. So then we start off with the members of the IEP team. And there are a couple of surprises in here. So let's dive right in. So what we learn in this subsection B is that the following people have to be on the IEP team. The parents of the child with a disability were first. This kind of goes to Congress's mandate that parents be involved in a very meaningful way in the IEP process. So parents are first. I actually write that in briefs a whole lot when I've got a parent participation issue in an IEP situation. The next person is not less than one gen ed teacher. Now, there's a parenthetical here that I actually think is a surprise. It says, if the child is or may be participating in the regular education environment. What this means is that if your child is not participating in general education, you do not have to have a gen ed teacher in the meeting. I think that's a surprise. I always want a gen ed teacher in a meeting. You know, I have plenty of students that are placed alternatively in residential placements. And I always have had a gen ed teacher in 100% of the meetings that I have participated in. And I did not remember that part, or that part never really stuck out to me until I started to prepare for this episode, to be perfectly honest. I think, if it ever came up that a school district said, gosh, we don't think we're going to put the gen ed teacher in the meeting, I think I would say, well, there's potential for the student to eventually come back to gen ed. And so I think it's appropriate now. I can foresee circumstances where I don't think it's a huge deal that the gen ed teacher isn't there. So I don't think, in 100% of meetings from today until the end of the world that I would mandate that, but just something to consider. Okay, so parents, gen ed teacher, at least one special education teacher. And then it says, or where appropriate, not less than one special education provider of the child. So in other words, you can send a proxy, and that might be the special education aide, or, the director of special education, something like that. I have had schools that have not sent the child's actual teacher, but have sent somebody else from the special education staff. I do not like that. I think what we learn here in a second can be applied. So parents, another person that can come to the meeting, and this is 6, but I'll go ahead and tell you, is at the discretion of the parent or of the school, other individuals, and here comes the quote, who have knowledge or special expertise regarding the child, including related service professionals as appropriate. So of course you can, the related service professionals are your OTs, PTs, speech pathologists, those folks. But this means that people that attend the IEP meeting have to have some knowledge and expertise regarding the child. And so if you take that back up to inviting just any old random special education teacher that, is employed by the district, I still think that they need to have specialized knowledge or experience regarding the child. And so a lot of times I'll say, no, we need the person that has the day-to-day experience with the child, because I don't see that there's any other way to get there. So that is requirement number 3. Moving on to requirement 4, a representative of the school. This is where we talk about like the chair, or, kind of the person that's in charge of that IEP team. And now this person has to meet 3 criteria. So they have to be qualified to provide or supervise the provision of especially designed instruction that is designed to meet the unique needs of the child. So typically this is the special education director, but it can also be the principal or another administrator. It can sometimes be a counselor, etc. But it has to be somebody who is qualified to provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction. I one time used this provision with a counselor that was to be quote unquote chairing a meeting, and they were not special ed teachers, and they were not trained to supervise special ed teachers. And I would not have made a fuss over it, except that the counselor seemed to kind of like get in the way of the meeting. And I really felt like one of the reasons she got in the way in the meeting was, I mean, to put it short, she didn't really like understand what was going on. And so I was like, this is the reason why this provision exists. We need people that know what they're talking about. And, I of course said it in a nicer way, but in short, it was like she didn't know what she's talking about and she's getting in the way. If she would sit quietly, that would be one thing, but that's not happening. Okay, so number 2, and there's an and here. So they have to, be qualified to either teach or supervise special ed teachers. Number 2 is they have to be knowledgeable about the general education curriculum. And number 3 is they have to be knowledgeable about the availability of resources that the district has. And I get tripped up in this one a lot myself. So it oftentimes happens that we get to the meeting and then we're making the list of demands. And I really think in a perfect world, the parents would make a list of what they're looking for and also information that they need from the district prior to the meeting so that those key decision makers could be there. I don't think it's fair to expect that every person on an IEP team have all information. But I also can't stand it when I go to a meeting and, a request is made or some kind of like exploration is requested. And then the district's like, well, we don't know. We're going to have to look into that further. And I'm like, are you serious? Now we've got to wait another 6 weeks to come back to the table. So in order to kind of balance that, we've got this requirement that this person that's in charge know what's happening at the IEP table, know what's available within the district. And I say, gosh, if you don't know, then you got to go find out before the meeting. Here's what we're going to be requesting. So in a perfect world, that's how that works. It isn't always feasible, but that is the requirement. And certainly, if you run into a situation where the lack of knowledge is egregious enough, that could be grounds for a procedural violation by way of a state complaint or something like that. Okay, so requirement number 5, you have to have at the meeting an individual who can interpret the instructional implications of evaluation results, who may be a member of the team and may not. And so this could be like the teacher, for example. Teachers can interpret the quality or well, they can interpret so it says instructional implications. Like what's the evaluation data say about how we should teach the child? Now, I have a couple of districts that don't send the psychologist to the meeting when an evaluation meeting happens. So a child has been evaluated either for the first time or on reevaluation. The evaluator is on contract with the district, but is not an employee of the district, and they don't come to the meetings. In 100% of those circumstances, that has been a problem. And in almost 100% of those circumstances, nobody there can interpret what the evaluation data means about how to teach the child. I think that's a huge problem. And in, most circumstances, I've been able to work around it using various modalities. But if that happens to you where the ed psych doesn't attend to the meeting, I think it's, I mean, obviously not, I think, but obviously here's your provision that says that they have to be there or somebody there has to be able to interpret it with some level of reasonability. Then we have 6, which means anybody else who has specific knowledge or expertise relative to the child. And then we have number 7, wherever appropriate, the child themselves, the child that has the disability. And we'll see when we get to transition, the age at which the child has to be invited. Okay, so those are the 7 people or descriptions of people that have to be at IEP team meetings in addition to kind of that catch-all provision. Now is a great time to take our first break, so I will catch you on the flip side. If you have ever thought about being a special education advocate or at least getting trained to work as a special education advocate, if you are an advocate that's looking for a community and additional business growth, I am so excited to welcome you to join our course called Advocacy, Business, and Concepts in Special Education. This digital course is designed for anyone who wants to turn their passion for special education into action. Whether you're just getting started or looking to refine your skills, this self paced digital course covers the fundamentals of advocacy, the business side of setting up and running a practice, and the core concepts that you will need to support families and with IEPs with confidence. I am so happy to announce that the ABC course is open for a very limited time for enrollment. Join us in March and April of 2025. You are welcome to bundle the ABC course with the lab if you think you need additional fundamentals, communication guides, and much more basic information. We hope you'll join us in the ABC course. Of course, you guys, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out by email, by DM, or responding to any of the emails that you get from me during the week. Okay. First of all, as is always the case, whenever I hit record to do anything, something really loud happens. I just took like a walk out both my front door and my back door. I have no idea what the construction noise is. It's not on my street, but it could be the street behind me. I hope it doesn't get in the way of this. You just can't control your environment all the time. And this is a good example. I feel like I'm like under attack. It's really loud, and so I apologize. Okay. To the extent that you can hear me, this is important stuff, so we're gonna keep going because I wanna get this information to you. So the next thing that we get is when attendance is necessary and when it isn't. So now we've moved on to subsection C, which is called IEP team attendance, and we have, one little I and then a little II. So C1 and C2. C1 is called attendance not necessary, and C2 is called excusal. Okay, so now we're talking about when somebody doesn't have to be in the meeting, and then number two, when we can excuse people from meetings. This is important because, if you think about the practicality, like laws have to be practical, they have to be reasonable. And, I always say, like, by and large, laws exist because things happen in the world, and lawmakers are, especially when they're first writing a brand new law from scratch, they have to kind of consider the what ifs. Now, you don't want to go down too many what ifs when you write a law or a contract or anything legal, because if you go down too many roads, then, something unforeseen happens, then it could be interpreted to be like, well, they planned for everything, so they must have considered this and left this out of the law or out of the contract. But, they've got to consider things that would happen often. And when we're requiring humans to be at something, we have to make exceptions to that rule, right? Because life happens to humans. And so we might have people that are only contracted for one day in a district. And in order to make their lives work, they have to work the other 4 days at other districts. We might have really little districts that can't pay their professionals to be at all their IEP meetings. I mean, there's 1,000, things could just happen, right? Like somebody could have a sick kid or something and they can't find a replacement. And then at the same time, the IEP could be emergent because, of a behavioral or a health matter or an instructional matter. And so we could have a kid that needs to have an IEP meeting with a OT that has to be at the hospital with their sick mother. And so the lawmakers said, okay, we need to make exceptions, right? And then there's everyday exceptions as well. So anyway, IEP team attendance. So as I said, subsection 1 of that says is called attendance not necessary. And what it says is that a member of the IEP team is not required to attend the IEP meeting in whole or in part. So they can show up to the beginning, they can show up to the end, or they can miss the entire thing if either the parent or I'm sorry, not either, both the parent and the school agree that the attendance isn't necessary because only because we aren't talking about that person's area of the curriculum or the related service is being modified or discussed. So we don't need the OT here because we aren't talking about OT. We don't need the speech path here because we're not talking about speech path. We don't need general education here because we're not talking about general education. I can't think of any specific circumstance where that would apply unless the child's in residential and we think the child's going to be in residential forever. And we don't think there's any way that we are not going to access general education. If I have a student in a special class 100% of the time, like an autism unit, so to speak, I still think I want a general education teacher there because the LRE requirement is so strong in idea that I really can't foresee a circumstance where I wouldn't be hoping and somehow planning for a child to have at least some touch to an inclusive environment in order to get that sense of belonging in the school environment. So that's how we can say that somebody isn't necessary. It really is, like, for me in practicality, it really is if we aren't talking about that subject area at all. Now, one little caveat to that is I think the reason why the team should be so comprehensive is because humans are beautifully dynamic. So, if we're talking about writing, there's a fine motor component. So, yeah, we might only be talking about writing, but there's a fine motor component. So I can foresee that I would want the OT there. Don't forget, OTs really work on, like, the brain, and the brain is involved in a lot of education. So it's not just fine motor, it's not just sensory. OTs can have a lot to say about behavior and about integration of many different areas of human development, right? So, but really, there are all kinds of reasons why we don't need those people there. So maybe we're just getting consent to evaluate. Well, then maybe we don't need, if we're evaluating for reading, then maybe we don't need the speech therapist there. But maybe we do because expressive language and vocabulary have a lot to do with reading. Okay? You see where I'm going here. So judgment call is important. And then subsection 2 talks about excusal. So we can excuse certain people from meetings and we can excuse them in whole or in part. They can come late, they can be at the beginning, or they can be excused altogether. And so we can do that if the meeting involves a modification to or discussion of that piece of the curriculum. If number 1, both the school and the parents consent to it, and B, that person submits in writing input to the development. So I've had it happen all the time where they're like, OT isn't coming. And I'm like, well, there's an OT component to this, and we don't have any feedback from OT in writing. So I think that we need to get that. And then, we can continue. There are times that I'm like, well, gosh, we really need to have this meeting. And so I've said, why don't we get the OT's information? Why don't we read that after the meeting? Why don't we kind of temporarily excuse them, but we are not waiving our right to continue this meeting in progress. And so we'll go ahead and meet because it's important to meet. We'll do the best that we can because none of us are OTs. And then we will get the OT's input in writing. We'll review it. And if we want to call a meeting to review that written thing or to bring the OT in based on their schedule, then we will do that. I've also had circumstances where I'm like, sorry, we can't meet because we don't have that information in writing and we don't, have any information from the OT. And that's going to be really helpful to move us along or whoever it is, right? And then this is interesting. It says that the parents' consent should be in writing. When I first started practicing in this area a lot, in the last 10, 15 years, I would excuse people all the time, like, oh, I don't care. We don't need that person. That's fine. And parents would just sign the meeting minutes and move on with their lives. And at some point I read this, I don't know when it became relevant, but I read this, it has to be in writing. And I'm like, oh, well, I've never done that before. So now at meetings, because I don't think people really focus on that. And in order to protect the validity, I don't want for a meeting to become invalid because my clients didn't follow procedure. So now if we excuse somebody, I just get out a piece of paper and say, why don't you just jot down, I'm okay with excusing the OT. and then sign it, and then we make that a part of the record, because if I'm excusing them, I want it to be very deliberate as well. Okay, and then finally, under our D1, which was definitions, we get this little very small requirement called IEP Team transition that says that if a child came from subpart 3, which is part C of IDEA, why make it easy? Wait, C means 3. Then the IEP meeting has to be done by the service coordinator. So if you come out of early intervention, part C is early intervention for ages 3 to 5, then your service coordinator conducts the transition of the IEP into grade school. So you go from part C to K to 5, and the service coordinator facilitates that. Okay, so now we are moving on to number 2. So let's refamiliarize ourselves again. We are in section 1414. We have done A, B, C, and now we are in D, and now we have moved on to 2. Number 1 was definitions. Number 2 is requirement that a program be in effect. That's our title. And so we're going to get A in general. We are going to get B, program for child age 3 to 5. Again, that's that part C thing. And we are going to get C, a program for children who transfer districts. Okay, so this little provision really talks about kids that are transferring from district to district, but we get some good information. And this is really pertinent to our families in the military, which transition from school to school fairly often, yearly, every 2 years, something like that. And, as well as to people that move. I represent lots of families that move from district to district. And so we have these provisions in place. So the title in and of itself kind of foreshadows what this is about: requirement that the program be in effect. So you don't lose your IEP when you move is kind of the idea here. So A says, in general, at the beginning of every school year, every kid that was on an IEP has to stay on an IEP. So we've got to make sure that the IEP is in place. B is about programs for children that are aged 3 to 5. So if you are in early intervention, and by the way, different states usually contract with different organizations. So in Kentucky, ours was called First Steps. They've got contracts with a lot of people, a lot of states. In Ohio, they use Help Me Grow, which also has contracts with multiple states. It could be some other name, but those are 2 kind of popular ones. So if your child was on a plan in those 3 to 5 years, what the law says is that the district, the IEP team, shall consider the plan that was there, and those early intervention things are called IFSPs, which stands for Individualized Family Service Plan. So the IEP team shall consider that IFSP, and they shall determine whether or not that should just go basically right into the IEP, so long as that's consistent with state policy. So in other words, if they want to just turn the IFSP into an IEP, they can. In practicality, I've never seen that happen. I usually see an evaluation at the age of 5 and then entry into the K to 5 years. But that is, I'm sorry, I got those years wrong. I usually see an evaluation at the age of 3 and then entry into preschool. So, but that's what can happen and is available. Then we talk about what happens when kids transfer from district to district. So if a child is in K to 12 and they're transferring from district to district, we have provisions for what happens if that is in the same state and then if it's in different states. Basically what it says is that schools have to adopt the IEP that was previously in place. And if they're in the same state, they can just adopt it and move on. If they're in a different state, then they can do their own evaluation and then move on. Now, there are a couple of kind of parentheticals. They aren't actually in parentheses, but a couple of additional requirements. And so here's what we know. First of all, that IEP has to have been in effect in another state or another district. Second of all, the services and instruction can be comparable. So we don't require that the services are completely identical. That would be nearly impossible to implement. Now, one thing I think that's really important here is think about service industry. So education really is a service industry. It's like a person is delivering a service to another person. So that runs parallel to what I do. I am an attorney and I provide services to my clients. And, like there are all kinds of characteristics of service industries. One is that my business, my law firm, isn't necessarily worth a whole lot because people contract me. They want Ashley Barlow. They don't just want, like a virtual law practice, or they don't just want a blonde attorney, or they don't just want, whatever. They want me. And so I can't necessarily sell my business for a ton because I don't come with it. Now, there are things that people want to buy in service industries. So, like if there's a painter that has corporate contracts, then people might want to buy the painter's book of business because then they might take over the contract for the big corporation or for the school district or whatever. But if you think about IEPs and schools as being in the service industry, that kind of helps to make sense with this transition transfer thing. Cause like, we might be in a district that does a really good job at assistive technology or really good job at reading, and then we're moving someplace else. Well, this new district doesn't have that skill subset of technology or reading instruction or whatever the case may be, right? So they've got to adopt it, but the services have to be comparable. And then they have to meet again to develop, adopt, and implement a new IEP that is still consistent with federal and state law, but isn't identical to the old one. And then we've got a little subsection 3 called transmittal of records, which basically says that the new school has to take reasonable steps to promptly obtain the child's records, including the IEP and supporting documentation, and any other records relating to the provisions of special education and related services from the previous district. Well, that totally makes sense. We've got to get the old stuff, and then the old school has to take reasonable steps to get the information to the new school. We have arrived at our number 3. We only have 2.5 pages of number 3, but this is called development of the IEP. So we're going to take our last little break and then we're going to jump into development of the IEP.
Hi, friends. It's Ashley, and I wanted to let you in on something that can seriously change the game when it comes to your IEP advocacy. It's called the Collaborative IEP Membership. Sometimes we call it ABC Club. And it's packed with resources to make your IEP meetings easier, less stressful, and way more effective. Here's what you get: my complete IEP binder. This baby includes monthly drops of communication templates, guides, and checklists to keep you organized and on top of things. Access to our school inclusion workshop, behavior workshop, and negotiation workshops. These are deep dives that give you real strategies you can actually use. And with the membership, you get all of our IEP Guru Academy videos. Short, practical videos that will answer the exact questions you're asking right now. Every month, we'll also drop new content like how to navigate PDA with your neurodivergent child, or exactly how to ask for Orton Gillingham reading instruction, so you're never left guessing. The membership is $29 a month or $297 for the entire year, and you can try it risk-free with a 3-day trial. Head over to the website, thecollaborativeiep.com/membership, and join us today. Let's make your next IEP meeting your best one yet.
Psych. I'm so sorry, you guys. I just checked our runtime. We're right at 30 minutes. I'm getting feedback from you all that you're really enjoying these episodes. And one thing that you're enjoying is that we can go more in depth, but that they are exhausting. And so I don't want to exhaust you on your walk or during your workout or while you're folding laundry. So we are going to postpone again. And we're going to talk about development of the IEP next week. So that's enough for today. I'm sorry to tease you. and tell you that we're talking about the IEP, but we're gonna wait yet one more week because it took us a second to get through that stuff. I'm sorry. Like I said, I am doing my best to get through this stuff for you, but there's a lot of information, and so I'm trying to go as quickly as possible, but I also don't wanna overwhelm you with our runtime. So, I will see you next week, same time, same place. I hope you have a great week.